I'm Alex Mozet, and welcome to Winner Take All, where we talk about the constant battle between large tech monopolies and traditional incumbents. And today, we've got a few different kind of litigious situations that are going on. The first topic is around what's going on with TikTok and the US government. There's been a lot of back and forth. Microsoft might buy TikTok, Oracle might buy TikTok. And I've just really struggled with the TikTok acquisition. It sounds nice on the surface. When you dive deeper into it, it just kind of is, I don't know, just fraught for a lot of execution risk for a variety of reasons. TikTok is trying to sell their US business and then their India business separately. And then they'd be giving source code to two separate entities. And how do you transition the personnel who are all based in China? And there are just so many problems with this. I don't think really anyone should buy TikTok. And I think their future is in trouble. But here's what they've recently decided to do. Looks like they're going to sue the US government because they're saying that they were never able to, they were not provided due process. And they didn't have the ability to show that they aren't a national security threat. So, do they have any stance or footing, or will this be successful? And the answer is no, it will not be successful. What everyone very easily neglects to mention, this is really where a lot of this precedent comes from. Grindr sold by Chinese owner after U.S. raised national security concerns. Grindr is the Tinder for the LGBT community. They had to sell it. And why is that? It's the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And basically, this committee had conducted their own analysis of TikTok operating in the United States. And this committee came back and raised the national security concern, similar to the concerns that they found for Grindr being bought by this Chinese entity, Beijing Kunlun. Similar concerns as it was for Grindr, as it is for TikTok. So, when this happened and when this the acquisition had been completed and then they basically reversed it, the review has been done. The analysis and the recommendation had been given to the president. And, I actually think the president has power regardless of this CFIUS analysis and how it comes back to ban a foreign entity from operating in the United States if there's national security concern. The president is actually given a very wide degree of power and lateral movement to take action or unilateral action. But not only does the president have huge powers to provide these bans or restrictions on foreign entities operating in the U.S., but coupled with the CFIUS assessment, you have a lot of evidence verifying that this decision is under the purview and is able to be made. This was opened back up in November of 2019. U.S. opens national security investigation into TikTok. It's literally the same exact deal structure as Grindr, right? I don't think many people know, but TikTok was acquired by ByteDance. TikTok used to be known as this company called Musical.ly. They bought it for $1 billion. So just for the same reasons that the Committee on Foreign Investment analyzed the Grindr acquisition, same thing. They've analyzed the Musical.ly acquisition and came back with recommendation to say there's national security concerns here. I think this lawsuit's futile. Another just kind of, I guess just a delay. I think that's really what the strategy is. I think they're just trying to delay any action from being taken or trying to get it hung up in the courts. Maybe if you file it in the right court, you can get a favorable decision, and then you go to appeal, and now you're I think they're just trying to delay. It helps them to negotiate an acquisition with any of the potential suitors, A, and B, I think the hope is that if they get they being China, if a more favorable candidate wins the election in November, then maybe they have more room to negotiate, or they could try and change this if Biden becomes president as opposed to Trump being reelected. So, I think this is really just a move on them to try and buy time. And, I think that's probably a smart decision, right? You want to just buy time. You want to try and push these timelines back, both if you are trying to sell yourself and, if you can have a more favorable negotiating environment with a Biden presidency. So we'll see. What's interesting, though, is that there's this other report that Zuckerberg warned Trump about the rise of the Chinese tech firms. And Zuckerberg's had dinner maybe at least once or twice with the president. Selfishly, it's good that the U.S. government tried to focus more so on, for Facebook selfishly, right? It's better that the U.S. government try to focus on Chinese tech companies operating in the U.S. than going after our U.S. tech monopolies. And, generally, I would say, there are problems and legitimate concerns in both scenarios. Yeah, but if you had to choose one or the other, which you frankly don't, there's enough resources on the government is so big that they could do many things at the same time if they wanted to. But yeah, if you were to have to choose one, certainly it'd be better for Facebook that they choose the former, to look at foreign tech firms, specifically Chinese tech firms operating in the US. And so what was interesting with this is, he really started. I'm sure the seed has been planted by many different people, but there's a sentence in here which I thought was pretty good. Around the time of the dinner, Zuckerberg warned U.S. officials and lawmakers that Chinese tech firms pose a risk to American values and the nation's technological dominance. Tech mogul is also said to have pointed out that TikTok, owned by ByteDance, doesn't share Facebook's commitment to freedom of expression. The interesting thing is, and when I was reading Larry Summers' interview from The Information, that publication, which I don't know, their writing, I take issue with a lot of how they frame these things. But in the interview that they had with Larry Summers, where he says, "Oh well, it's not clear to me that TikTok and ByteDance is using this data to enable the CCP, to enable the Chinese government." And there's this seemingly rhetoric in the United States that is kind of claiming ignorance about, oh, well, if it's a Chinese tech company, is that data actually going back into the government, and so on and so forth. And I think that's just kind of, ignorance is bliss, right? It's just naive. I think there's an abundance of evidence, and it is a very safe assumption to have a universal understanding that these large Chinese tech monopolies are directly linked to the CCP. Earlier on in the show, we've talked about this a lot, where there are actual entire divisions of Chinese government officials inside of these companies. They have offices. They're actually, down the hall kind of relationship. They've put teams of government officials into these companies, and these government officials are there to help monitor the content, curate the content, what is being allowed, what is being banned, and so on and so forth. We've shown plenty of reports, right? It's actually publicly admitted by a lot of these big Chinese tech companies that they have these kind of government divisions or government personnel in the business, helping them work through all these matters. So it's just very peculiar to me why, a lot of folks in the kind of tech world like to kind of claim that they haven't seen the linkage. They don't know if the data from TikTok is actually being fed back into the the Chinese government or not, and so on and so forth. I mean, at this point, it's kind of comical, frankly, but in a very pained way, not truly funny, just kind of frustratingly ignorant. But I digress. The next thing that we're seeing is this thing going on with Epic Games versus Apple. So basically, here's what happened. Epic has Fortnite. They have iOS apps for Fortnite, even though the game originated on other consoles besides, phones. It was on the computer and it was on your consoles like Xbox and PlayStation, and then it made its way to smartphones. So now Apple's responded to the lawsuit from Epic Games, saying that they asked for special treatment. They said, hey, the CEO emailed us to try to get special exceptions and carve-outs. Basically, Epic Games released a direct payment mechanism inside Fortnite designed to bypass the App Store's payment system, from which Apple takes a 30% cut. Apple then removed Fortnite from its store for violating its policies. It's just more of these, like, I don't know, it's like I'm living in an alternate reality or something where, what is painstakingly obvious and straightforward and simple just somehow magically becomes confusing to everyone. And what is it? I guess they said that Steve Jobs did it like, he would alter reality. He kind of had this like perception change on people. And so you have here, this is the CEO of Epic. And I like this guy, Tim. He's taken a stance on, some hard issues about, even though Tencent is an investor, Chinese tech monopoly, Tencent is an investor in Epic, saying that they would keep their independence and all these kinds of things. I liked him, but this is that kind of just distorted reality here. He says, today Apple said Epic is seeking a special deal. That's not true. We're fighting for open platforms and policy changes equally benefiting all developers. And here it'll be a hell of a fight. I want all iOS developers are free to process payments directly. All users are free to install software from any source. I just don't know what world this guy is living in. I mean, maybe you just make a huge ask, or, you have a lawsuit and you're setting the goalposts all the way over here in the hopes that, you're never going to get all the way over here on that end of the spectrum. But because you anchor the conversation or you anchor the lawsuit at such an extreme point, if you can win here, then that's, or if you settle here, then that's a win. Maybe that's the strategy. But it just doesn't make any sense, right? Literally, since over a decade now, Apple takes 30% of in-game app purchases. Okay. I mean, this was actually the original category of apps that first had in-app monetization. So gaming, it was the first category of apps. If we rewind, I don't know, 13 years ago now, back to the App Store, and back then, all you would be able to do is basically, it was free apps or paid apps. The whole idea of in-app purchasing was new at that time. So it was free or paid. And then Apple launched for games, for game developers, the functionality to let you download a game for free and then monetize the usage. So let you sell in-game items. This started with gaming apps. This was literally the genesis of the freemium app model. And so now what Tim is saying is, this is unfair, and Apple should take nothing from the transaction. The irony in this is just so bonkers to me. There are just so many contradictions that this guy is just swimming in, and I guess just hoping people don't call him out on. I mean, Microsoft takes a fee, okay, on the Xbox, right? So does PlayStation, Sony, and on the PC, where Fortnite started, they launched their own app store competitive to the incumbent, the current incumbent, which is Steam, owned by Valve. And that was a PC game store. Now, Epic launched their own game store to be competitive with that. So, I mean, this guy understands platforms very well. We've actually studied what Epic did with their PC game store on the show and talked about why it was a big win for them. But, you know, he just wants it his way. And I think he's willing to say whatever it is, right? We're fighting for open platforms to benefit all developers. And this means that all users developers are free to process payments directly, and you don't have to pay the gatekeeper anything. There's just no basis for this. There's no precedent for this. The strategy, or what they say, the point of this, just like the TikTok's lawsuit and this thing, it's just, there's got to be some kind of ulterior motive here, because the guy's a smart guy and there's no way he's going to win this. So, you know, maybe he's just trying to curry some favor. And again, it's not like Epic and Fortnite is hurting. It's not like, for example, we've seen Spotify sue Apple. And that is a much better lawsuit, because in that scenario, Apple is vertically integrating and is competing with Spotify, right? They have Apple Music. As we've covered on the show, where platforms get into trouble is when they compete with their supply, when they compete with their producers. Epic would be a producer, but is Apple creating its own version of like a shooter Fortnite competitor and then launching that? No, they're not. You know, they just have a rule, which is if you want to buy stuff in the app, you pay us 30%. It's literally been around for over a decade. There's no special treatment, or there's no kind of special attack that they took on Epic or Fortnite. Spotify, though, has much more precedent in their lawsuit, because Apple Music doesn't have to pay a 30%, right? You can sign up for Apple Music. Apple could price Apple Music at the same as where Spotify is. But because Spotify has to pay 30% to Apple, you know, Apple is a big, you know, has basically 30 extra points of margin, because they don't have to pay the gatekeeper. They are the gatekeeper. And so that's where you see platforms get into trouble, when they vertically integrate, they compete with their suppliers, with their producers. Apple's not even doing that. So like the risk of this lawsuit to Apple versus other lawsuits that they've had, and some are still ongoing. I mean, this is even on the radar. Just more of these kind of crazy things that I don't know. Maybe the media wants to cover some stuff. Maybe it's a slow news day. I don't know. Last one. Okay, last one. Let me back up. Did my topics weird today. So, the Information. This publication, which I'll show you a couple examples about why the way they write these articles, you know, they just make these kind of like overgeneralized statements, which are just not true. And they report good material, but then they take it a step further, and then they make these just grand statements, which really detract, I think, from the quality of the article or the point they're trying to get across. Okay, now, and it's loading forever. But basically, while that loads, here's what happened. Domio is one of a few of these short-term rental startups. A short-term rental startup is a business. It's a linear business. They own the inventory. Inventory is on their balance sheet. They basically take apartments. They're furnished, and they rent them on Airbnb, VRBO, directly to the consumer if they can. Just an alternative to hotels, just like what Airbnb is providing. Think of it as like professionally managed inventory on Airbnb. So you have a certain quality and brand with each one of these apartments, right? So if you're a consumer, it's a Domio branded apartment. There's a few other of these companies, Sonder, Lyric, which is having a lot of trouble. I mean, all these companies are having trouble because of the pandemic. And all their inventory are in these more highly populated areas, metropolitan areas. And so they're all having a difficult time. It's a very capital intensive business. You have these leases on your balance sheet, right? They are actually leasing these properties and then essentially reselling them on these short-term rental sites like Airbnb. When you look at the listing growth on Airbnb and where that's coming from, actually a lot of it is coming from these kind of professional listers. People that actually have a real business, listing properties on Airbnb, as opposed to where Airbnb started, which is with like user generated, right? This is my home, this is my apartment. Maybe you have two homes, maybe you're just out of town, and you're gonna list out that inventory when you're gone. So it's actually also from the information from a while ago. So you can see here in the red are dark red are full homes available less than 6 months. So think about that as, again, kind of that original user. This is someone's home. They're now leaving for vacation or whatever. They have a second home. So the red, you can see that declining year over year, right? These are kind of that classic user generated content. Private rooms, same thing. This is the kind of lightly shaded red. That's declining year over year. Private rooms, right? So I now have a house and I'm renting out a room in that house. So if you think about those two buckets, those buckets are people's primary residences, right? The dark red and the medium red. I don't know what this is, like a light brown red, the lightest one of the three, and the one that is growing year over year are full homes available more than 6 months. Clearly not a primary residence if it's being available for more than 6 months out of the year. Why this is important is because a lot of the rules and laws that local municipalities, towns, states have put into place revolve around whether or not you are renting a primary residence on Airbnb, or if you are in the business of buying a home and an apartment and then renting it out on these sites. There's a whole bunch of reasons why this is like the critical kind of criteria. And there's a bunch of legitimate reasons, and then, not so fun reasons, kind of corrupt reasons, but hey, that's life. So you got a mixture. You got a whole range of reasons why, but that's kind of what it is. Like New York City, they look at, is this your primary residence that you're renting versus, are you, and do you own it and you're renting it versus are you renting it from a landlord and then you're re-renting it, and all these other kinds of considerations. So that's also why that chart was looking at kind of full homes. Anyway, the point is, this Domio article came out on the information recently. How one rental startup gamed Airbnb. And they make a lot of really legitimate points here. Basically, you had a bunch of these employees at Domio claiming that they had these private residences in Nashville that talks about, or New York City, and then renting those on Airbnb and then giving Domio control to manage the rental and all that kind of stuff. So in the eyes of Airbnb and I guess the city, it was a primary residence for many of these cases, which they catalog in the article. It was not the primary residence. So that was not true. That was a lie. And that's a problem, because not only are you lying to Airbnb, you're lying to the city, the state that you're in, but also, it's a company sanctioned lie. And this was a systemic thing, right? They'd hire new managers in a market, and then they'd say, great, now go verify yourself with Airbnb, put your driver's license into Airbnb, so they could put more listings up, right? So it would help the business. And the information does a good job kind of cataloging these issues, and all these violations and so on and so forth. And basically, if you think about Airbnb, they have gotten around a lot of these issues, regulatory issues. They're supposed to go public in September by being neutral and saying, hey, you know what? Kind of like we're going to turn a blind eye. Hey, renters, you need to follow the rules from the city or state that you operate in, and that's our policy, right? Airbnb is not here to advocate on behalf of the renter. Airbnb, I think for the most part, does not release renter information to the cities, who would then, try to look at the renters and then see if which ones of them are lying. So they've kept a wall there from sharing information with the cities, but by no means is Airbnb actively advocating to try and, aggressively change the rules and laws. They've kind of taken a back seat to this and let the cities and states, put in their own rules around this, and say protect the hotel industry and different industries like that. If someone is caught in violating these rules, then Airbnb kicks you off the platform. That's pretty much the stance, right? If it's kind of brought to their attention or you're falsifying information, then they ban you. So, I wouldn't say they're like aggressively trying to vet all of these renters as diligently as they could. Otherwise, they'd probably kill off half the inventory on the site. But when there is a violation or someone does get caught who's breaking the rules, then they say, oh, that was really bad of you, renter, and I'm kicking you off, and Airbnb is not responsible. That's kind of the stance. Now, this was not always the case. When Airbnb was getting going, they actually participated in a lot of very gray matter type of policies. We actually cover a few of those in the book. Like they were going on Craigslist and they were posting ads and listings on Craigslist, or they were messaging people on Craigslist to harvest users off of Craigslist. They had, a myriad of listings which were clearly in violation. I mean, the regulation today has been written to account for the Airbnb and VRBOs of the world. But when Airbnb was starting in its first few years, those laws didn't account for a marketplace for short-term rental. So literally Airbnb was in violation, and Airbnb's business was actually illegal in its top 20 markets for the first 3 to 5 years of the company's existence. So the reason I bring this up is because, once your business gets to that breakout scale, once you kind of get to that critical mass point where you have really turned consumer behavior into your back court, right? Where consumer behavior is behind you, consumers want to use your product or service, you create so much value for consumers and probably producers as well, that it would be too difficult for the state or the government or the city to ban you outright. And, one could argue that every platform business is kind of a hedge against the regulation at the time. Can the platform business get that breakout velocity, get enough scale before the regulators catch up or ban the service, right? Or can the platform scale fast enough, create enough goodwill, PR, brand, reputation, that society deems it to be good, essentially, and that the officials can't ban this outright. In other countries, we have seen services like Uber and Airbnb banned outright, just for reference. And so, I would say to some degree, every platform business is kind of a hedge against regulation. Can you scale fast enough to overcome it? But my issue with these kinds of articles is that Domio, along with better known companies like Lyric and Saunders, since its founding, the company has raised $70 million in venture capital along with $50 million in debt. It has hired upwards of 160 employees and has had over 100,000 travelers use its services. Airbnb's official response to this is, we have indefinitely suspended all of Domio's associated host accounts and listings as we expand our investigation into their activity dating back to 2016. We will not hesitate to take aggressive action to remove suspicious content from our platform, and depending on the outcome of our investigations, we will determine the appropriate long-term action to take against these accounts. Let's pause there. I'm willing to guarantee that people inside of Airbnb knew what Domio was doing. This is not some shocker news to Airbnb. Airbnb, very smart people, lots of good data. There's actually a function. All these managers were assigning their primary residence homes over to Domio. So you don't think that some, supply side manager at Airbnb would look at Domio, who, as the information says, has raised collectively over $100 million between equity and debt capital, that this business with over $100 million in funding, over 100,000 customers over the past 4 years, that no one at Airbnb said, I wonder if Domio has a systemic problem. I wonder if they're kind of skirting our rules and issues. Because, by the way, Airbnb has taken action against a few specific accounts of Domio's on Airbnb, and they treated them as kind of individual cases. But they never launched a broader investigation. What this article from The Information talks about is that Airbnb would kind of kick off these one-off circumstances when, say, Nashville was getting grumpy at some of the Domio people, and then Airbnb would take action, right? But now that the story is blown up, now all of Domio is under review. So again, Airbnb is not the kind of angel in this story. Airbnb knows what's going on here, okay? It is in their best interest to take some action, but not ultra aggressive action, because otherwise Airbnb would have a big problem. As we saw in the first graph, all of the growth in listings is coming from these kinds of more professional renters. So Airbnb is kind of in a very precarious position on this one. But here's my other issue with the reporting. Then they go, so they talk about all of Domio's infidelities, and they say, but it's unusual for a startup with prominent VC backers like Domio to employ such tactics. And here's the problem with this kind of, these just kind of like blanket fake statements. It's just not true. All of these platform startups, and this isn't even a platform startup, Domio, but so many startups, and a lot of the platform startups, for not just like a few months, but a few years, and in those few years, they're getting money from these prominent VC investors. They are hacking their way to, not like computer hacking, but business hacking, product hacking, user acquisition hacking. They are trying out a bunch of different creative tactics. We've seen Uber get ridden up on a bunch of these, right? Where they would have like literally like burner cell phones and credit cards, and they'd have employees go take lifts to try to recruit the Lyft drivers while in the passenger seat, right? I mean, or they were doing it maliciously and booking Lyft rides and then canceling on the drivers last minute, right? Like every platform has these war stories. Not saying that the war stories are okay, but I feel like this article unfairly makes Domio out to be some horrible startup business that is so unique to the real estate industry that no other one of these real estate startups would ever do something like this. And it's just not true, right? Airbnb itself has done a lot of these things. And Airbnb itself, I guarantee, knew long before any state, New York City, Nashville knew, they knew what Domio was doing. And so, I don't know. I just feel like these articles take a very aggressive stance against, against the company that everyone wants to beat up on. They don't do justice in terms of providing an equal assessment of all the parties and how they have behaved. So with these blanket statements like that, right? Like Domio is the exception. Domio is not the exception. Let's look at what Airbnb is doing in Japan, because this is interesting. Airbnb is legal in Japan. Historically, Airbnb had been banned in, not Airbnb, but any of this kind of short-term rental cottage industry. It was just wholesale banned in Japan. The interesting thing about Japan is a lot of Japan is actually very centralized and federally controlled. They have an idea of states and like provinces, but those states and provinces don't have nearly the amount of authority or ability to, for example, set their own taxes that states in the United States do. So there's much less autonomy given to these local kind of regions and provinces and states in Japan. Everything is actually very federally centralized, controlled. It's a whole other separate topic, which I think is a big challenge for Japan. You want to embrace innovation and different ways of doing things, whether it's with technology or just other systems and process. Very hard to manage all of that centrally. With short-term rentals in Japan, in June of 2018, Japan imposed new home sharing regulations that affected Airbnb listings throughout the country. Initially, the number of listings dropped significantly. They were like halved, as many owners were not prepared to comply. And then as Airbnb has built out tools, the business is coming back pretty nicely. As a result of the new regulations, all Airbnb hosts in Japan must register their listing and display a license number on their listing page. And then Airbnb removed non-compliant listings. So if property in Japan has a listing on Airbnb, it's legitimate, it has one of these codes. So, you're seeing different operating models for, platform companies, and what role do they take on relative to the government? How aggressively do they fight regulation? How much of it do they kind of just put on the seller or the producer, for example? It's a moving target. None of this stuff is static. We're seeing right now Uber and Lyft in California, AB5, prompting to leave the state. So it's a constant battle. And if you take a giant step back and you think about it, the regulation and the laws currently in place were built for a world not inhabited by platforms, right? Literally, platform businesses did not exist 30 years ago. Nope. Microsoft really being the first platform tech monopoly. There's other businesses like we talk about AT&T and Ma Bell in the book that have network effects. There's other businesses that have had network effects, but really having demand and supply, consumer producer, this two-sided relationship, facilitating exchange, really Microsoft, the first one that really hit that scale. And so when you just think about rules and laws, whether local, state, federal, US, Japan, elsewhere, there is a constant back and forth between platform business models, which by definition are disruptive, which by definition are going to change how an industry operates and how value is exchanged and monetized. And so I think if you look at this, at a high level and you say to yourself, all these platform businesses technically, I would argue, are going to be in violation of some law when they start. If you're not, you're probably not doing anything disruptive enough, right? These laws have been written decades and decades ago, and they were written, a lot of them influenced by lobbyists and, by big business that had a linear business model, right? So you got a big business with lobbyists, and this is how their business operates in a linear fashion. So the laws are going to be put into place with that linear business model in mind, which means that when you have a new business model, the platform business model come along, it changes a lot of that. It doesn't mean that these businesses are deliberately trying to, break the law and defraud customers and suppliers and, spread ill will, but it just means, take Uber, for example. Uber was illegal in just about every one of its early markets. Airbnb, illegal in just about every one of its early markets for years, until the regulators could see the value, until consumers could speak up that they liked this service and they wanted to keep it around, and regulators could understand what the business model is, how it works, and how you could think about regulation through a new mindset, right? So, I think, Domio, for example, here, and the role that Airbnb has played, what Airbnb said is, we're not going to fight this anymore. We're going to let every state and jurisdiction figure this out. Domio clearly doing some deceptive tactics here. All these startups have done deceptive tactics. Whether or not those deceptive tactics are viewed very negatively, or how much media attention is given to them is a byproduct of a few things, but one, namely, how much breakout scale and velocity can you get, where now you can clean up a lot of these tactics that helped you kind of play that chicken and egg game initially. And then, and as regulation matures and your business operations mature, now you can kind of operate in code and without any of these, or at least with less regulatory risk. As we are still seeing, though, irrespective of how big you get, there's always going to be some kind of regulatory risk. Whether it's you've gotten so big now you have antitrust regulatory risk at one end of the spectrum, or you have these AB5 law things going on with gig economy workers in California, or you have now Chinese tech companies coming into the U.S. and having regulation there. So there's a whole spectrum of regulation. Hopefully from today's episode, you could hear a little bit how I think about what legislation is legitimate, what legislation or regulation is actually a threat or needed. For a lot of these U.S. tech companies, they are able to get a competitive advantage in the United States. All things being said, everything that I just spoke about in terms of regulation, you compare the United States regulatory environment versus, let's say, Europe. Let's say India, even. India's put in, a number of kind of protectionist rules around what foreign platform companies can do or cannot do. They did this to Walmart and Flipkart. When Walmart bought Flipkart, kind of like a Jet.com in India, India put regulation around what a foreign-owned marketplace can do in terms of being a marketplace versus being a linear reseller. Europe has a whole bunch of rules around it. So I would still say generally, Japan has a very difficult time with this because it's all centrally ruled, right? So you can't have different states have different rules. It's very centralized regulation, which means I'd say it's very restrictive. China, you can't even get into. So you look at the landscape. I would say the U.S. has a much better operating environment when it comes to regulation and how much that can hamper innovation of these new startups compared to the rest of kind of the geographic climate. I think the US still is leading the way. Other environments, like let's say Europe, that have seen a lack of tech startup innovation, unfortunately, I think regulation is a real contributing factor as to why they have struggled to see more innovation. It's not just these startups' ability to get going. It's also the investor appetite, right? When the investors see all these rules and regulations and fines and you could be banned and all, that investor capital is going to be much harder to come by, much more expensive, just much more scarce. So all of these things feed into each other, and the role of regulation can be a tool in the toolbox of any country. Or depending upon how much jurisdiction you have, state or local municipality, to set your own rules around these things, right? That can actually be a huge way to say invite more startup innovation or startups to come to your market, right? Because you are creating a friendlier environment for these innovators to take root and get going. So it's very interesting, this balance between regulation and startup innovation. That's it for us today on Winner Take All. Thanks for joining. I'll talk to you later this week.